Well, so thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm Peter Goddard, and my role here in District 65 is Chief Officer of Research, Accountability, and Data. And so part of what my team does is to support our teachers in the whole range of student assessment, from our formative tests all the way through our MAP testing and our state accountability testing. So I'm really glad to have a chance to meet with you, and I hope that by the time we leave here tonight, I will both have had a chance to give you a sense of how to interpret the score reports that you receive for your students, as well as give you a chance to ask any questions you might have about either the PARCC scores or the PARCC testing. So just to give you a sense of our agenda for tonight, we're going to spend the first 20 minutes or so going through an activity where I will show you how to interpret your own child's scores. If you have a score report from your child with you, feel free to pull that out. Otherwise, when you walked in, I handed out a sample report for one of our students where I've taken the name and identifying information off so that we can all look at the same report. After that, we'll spend about 10 minutes and we'll go through the District 65 results, and I can show you how we're doing as a district. Then I'll take about 5 minutes and just give an update about what's going to change about PARCC testing for this upcoming year. And then we'll conclude the evening with as much time as you would like for any questions that you might have, either as a group, or I'm also glad to stick around if you have individual questions about your own students' reports. So the other thing I want to just touch on a little bit is state and federal policy. It was really hard last year, I think, to be on Facebook or the internet and not read differing viewpoints about PARCC. And there have been a lot of changes in federal legislation in the last year or so since we first implemented PARCC. So there's a lot of information I can provide you about that. What I'd like to do, though, is to put those type of questions in the parking lot for now. And that way, everybody can have a chance to learn about how to interpret the scores. And for those who are interested in learning more about the changes in state and federal policy around testing, I'm glad to stick around. I'm kind of a policy geek for this particular topic, so I'd be glad to talk to you about it. The one thing I would note, though, is that we've done a lot of work in the last year in two regards to try to make things better. So we've had a lot of questions from parents about why does my child have to take so many different assessments? And the real answer to that question is complicated. Part of it is that we want to make sure that teachers and students are getting regular feedback. And so the vast majority of the assessments that we use in District 65, anywhere from quizzes all the way up through our MAP testing, are designed to help provide feedback to teachers and students. But we recognize that assessment does take a significant amount of time, and we want to shrink the amount of time that we're using for assessment so that we maximize the amount of time that we are giving teachers and students for learning. So one of the things we've done in the last year is to gather a group of teachers together with us last summer and to revisit our assessment calendar. As a result, we were able to knock out a number of different tests where there was another test that provided similar information and we could just cross it off the list. So one of the things I would recommend you consider doing is going on our District 65 website, which is district65.net. And there, if you just search for calendar, you can see our assessment calendar. It gives a description of why we give different tests, and it also, you can click on any grade level and see the calendar of tests that are used in that grade level. And again, feel free to call me anytime. I'm glad to talk more about why we do the assessments that we do. And I know that classroom teachers are also glad to share their perspective on the different assessments that they use. So let's jump into how to interpret your own child's score. So each of you has a copy of a page that looks like this, which is actually a score report for an anonymous District 65 student. You could also pull out your own child scores if you have them with you. The other document that I gave you that I just want to show you is one that has a blue bar here up at the top, and this is available in both English and in Spanish. And this has some basic information about how to interpret the different scores that you see on the spreadsheet, or on the report that you've got. So I would also say feel free to pull out your cell phones or iPads or pull them up at home. If you're staring at a screen during this meeting, that's actually a great thing to me because it means you're probably on one of the resources that I'm going to show you. I really encourage you to take a look at some of those. One of them that I'll bring up on the screen is called understandthescore.org. And this is a website that you can use to get more information than just what's on this one sheet. It's very parent-friendly. There are a number of different videos on there. And so it's a great place to learn more about the PARCC test and the PARCC test results. So I would just offer that to you as one resource that's out there to look at, and we'll look at it together in just a minute. So let's take a look at this individual score report. There are a couple of things that I want to show you. This is a math report that I handed out, and a math report that we've got up on the screen behind me. One thing I would point out over on the right-hand side, about a third of the way down the page, is that you'll see a performance level. And so for the example student, you'll see that the student scored in performance level 4. There are 5 different performance levels, and the state has given a name to each one of those. The top 2 performance levels, level 4 and 5, are considered proficient on the state test. And I'll talk in a few minutes about what does it mean to be proficient. There's a couple ways to understand that. But for this example, just kind of walking through the report first of all, you can see that this child has a performance level of 4. The next thing that I would point out is that the child also has a scale score. So on the example that I gave you, you can see the child has a math scale score of 753. So for this 5th grader, you can see the scale runs from 650 to 850. And that score of 753 puts them just over the line of the level 4 performance level. So what the heck does that mean is probably the question I would be asking. I think the succinct answer, and then I would be glad at another time or afterward to answer specific questions of the statistics behind it, is that it just gives you a sense of how far into the particular performance level the student is scoring. So in this case, 753 is just above 750, which is the cut point for level 4. So this student is scoring on the lower end of the level 4 category, which puts them just above the state standards. A couple other things you would maybe want to look at on this report is that you can see that there are state, district, PARCC, and school averages, and that just gives you a sense of where the student is scoring in comparison to other students across the district, other students across the state, and other students in all the PARCC states. So the student here scored a 753, which is right at the school average. It's about 8 scale score points higher than the district average of 745. It's quite a few points higher than the state average, which is 732. And it's also higher than the PARCC average of 736. So that's an initial way to understand, in addition to the performance levels, how well is the student that you're looking at doing in comparison to some averages. The last thing I'd point out is at the bottom of the page, you can see that there are 4 different content areas that make up the math test. And for each one of these areas, you see either that the student is below, nearly meeting or exceeding expectations. And I'll show you in a minute a tool where you can translate that into actual skills that a student would be able to do. The last thing I want to point out before I give you some context of how can we interpret what this means is that on the reading assessment, I haven't handed out a copy of this, but you can see it in the PowerPoint and on the slide behind me. There is a reading test and a writing test, and the scores for those tests are shown in comparison to some averages. All of the questions on the test fall either into the reading test or the writing test. So the overall performance level is a summary of the 2 tests together. So, kind of giving you a guide to the scores that are on the page. And what I want to turn to next are some comparisons you can use to further understand what those scores mean. But since we're a small group, let me just pause here and see, are there any questions that you might have just in terms of basic understanding of what's on the page before we get into interpretation? Yeah. Yeah. So the question, just for those who may be watching this online, was basically, there are a number of scores on this page. The report goes back to my teacher, and then what is my teacher supposed to do with this information? It's a question that I think I can go into a little bit more at the end, but let me give you sort of a short answer right now, which is that this is one data point among many data points. And it's also, in this first year, a data point that's already 6 or 9 months old by the time the teacher is getting it. So when the state is implementing the test as it should be implemented and designed, the teacher should be getting feedback right at the end of the school year. And really, this assessment fits into our suite of assessments as a summative assessment. So it's not really meant to provide feedback about what should be done differently in the classroom with the teacher that the student is with, but it's really meant to be just like when you go to the doctor, you get an annual physical. It's mostly meant to say, at the high level, having had a whole year of instruction with a lot of nuanced information from homework assignments and quizzes and other assessments, where does the student fall in comparison to state standards? And it's just meant to be a double check about whether the information that the teacher has gathered through all of those daily quizzes and assignments and interim assessments is adding up to the student meeting state standards. So think about it like the results of an annual physical, more so than feedback about what should be done differently in the classroom tomorrow. March, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about upcoming changes to the PARCC assessment in a little bit, which gets a little bit into what we can expect going forward. But what I would say is that currently District 65 is implementing the MAP assessment because the state assessment is not meeting our needs to provide information to us on a timely basis. And there is a redundancy, quite frankly, between a summative MAP assessment and a summative PARCC assessment, but it's something we feel like we need to live with right now in order to both meet the requirements of the state and the need to give our students and teachers good feedback at the end of the school year, within the school year, about how things turned out. So let me talk next about how to interpret your child's scores on this page. I'm going to show you two different ways that I think it's worth thinking about. And the first is just, how is this compared to the statewide distribution of scores? So on your handouts and on the slide behind me, you'll see that there are some percentile rankings associated with these 5 performance levels. And what I basically want to point out about this is that you can see from these percentiles that the scores on the PARCC are a lot more rigorous in terms of the standard than what you would have seen on the ISAT. So for example, when you look at reading, which is the blue box on the left, in order to get a score of exceed standards, a student has to score between the 95th and the 99th percentile. So we have kids in our schools who are doing great. Students who are getting A's on everything, and who won't exceed standards. And that's because you have to be in the top 5% of performance in order to be in that category. Then if you were to go down to the approach standards, that's the third category, you can see that students in the approached category could score anywhere between the 35th and the 62nd percentile. So you can be scoring at the 60th percentile, which is actually doing quite well. It's better than 59% of students in the country, and it's well above average. And yet you would be in the approached standards category. So I give this to you so that as you're looking at your own student scores, it just gives you a sense that if my student isn't exceeding standards, that doesn't necessarily mean that my student is not doing quite well. And if my child is in the approached standards category, it still could mean that my student is actually performing above the state average. So it just gives you a little sense of how to interpret those scores in relation to the distribution of students across the state. Next, I want to just give you a sense of how do I interpret what this means in terms of the actual things that my child was able to do when they took the test, which I think is what the report in front of you really lacks, and I think it gets a little bit at the question that you were asking before about, so what is my teacher supposed to do with this? So there's a website, and I've created a shortened link for it so that it's easier to get to. It's bit.ly/PARCC for parents, and there's also a Spanish link that's bit.ly/PARCC para padres. This link will take you to a site that I'll show you in just a second, where you can look up your student's grade level and then their performance level, and from there you can begin to see some of the skills associated with those 4 categories on the bottom. So let me just click through here. And you can see that it's going to take you to a website where if you scroll down, it's going to ask you to select a grade. So I'm just going to pick 5th grade, which is the sample report that you have in front of you. And you can see that you can choose between ELA and math over here on the right. So I'll bring up math because, well, they really are persistent about getting updates. Here we go. Math is the report that you've got in front of you. So you'll see that there are 4 categories down here in the bottom, and they relate back to the 4 categories on the report that you have in front of you. So just as an example, the student that we've got in front of us is nearly meeting expectations in expressing mathematical reasoning. So I just want to show you that you could click on mathematical reasoning, and it will begin to show you some information about what does mathematical reasoning mean, and what would a student who meets standards be able to do. It also has some resources here about how you could help with this particular topic, and there are some videos that show some example questions in some cases as well. So this can give you a richer understanding of what kind of question was my child asked, what are they expected to do, if they weren't able to meet this standard, what would meeting this standard look like, and that can give you an entry into having a conversation with your child or with your child's teacher about how they have progressed since then on that particular area. You can also look at the standards for that topic for the next grade level up. And so you can kind of see in the grade they're in today, what will they need to be able to show that they're able to do on the PARCC this year. So again, one is just where's my child doing in comparison to other kids across the state. The other is what are they able to do. The other thing I would point out is that when they set these PARCC performance levels, they gathered a group of about 250 teachers across the country, and these 2 factors that I'm talking about are what played into how they set the performance levels. So on one hand, they actually sat with the performance descriptors of what should a child who meets standards be able to do. What is a child who exceeds standards? What are they able to do? Partially meets, what are they able to do? And then they looked at student work from PARCC test responses and calibrated the setting of those performance levels based on teachers looking at what students were able to do and then the descriptors of what that performance level should mean. The other thing they did is they took test results from the ACT, from the SAT, and other college readiness tests, and they did some correlation to look at whether the cut point between partially meets and meets is predictive of hitting a college-ready cut point on one of those college entrance exams. And those college entrance exams, if we take the ACT, for example, predict students' ability to get a B or a C in their college course in the associated subject. So here there's both a look at, are students able to demonstrate the skills associated with grade level standards, and do they obtain a score that is predictive of their ability to pass college coursework if they proceed in the average path of students coming from the same start point. So those are the two things that went into the performance levels. Oops. So next I'll spend just a couple minutes running through some District 65 results with you. Give you just a quick overview of what's going to change for this year, and then I'll be glad to take some additional questions. So first, looking at District 65 results in English Language Arts. You can see on this chart, which is on page 11, how we did. We are the lighter blue color on the left compared to the Illinois average. As I mentioned, only 6% of kids across the state fit into that exceeds performance level 5. In District 65, we had almost twice that many. And you can see in performance level 4 that we also had a larger percentage of students than across the state. So District 65, just as we've seen on our MAP test, does a lot better than the state and national averages. Next, this just shows you a number of different benchmarks that we used. I mentioned that we give the MAP test as a way of giving ourselves some feedback and giving our students some feedback earlier than the PARCC test can give us. And you'll see here that if you look at the green bar, that's the PARCC proficiency in English Language Arts. That's at 49%. For the MAP test in reading given the same year, we predicted a 50% proficiency. So those two are matching up quite well. And you can see that they're significantly lower than the benchmarks on the ISAT that are on the left. Next, I'll just show you a couple quick charts that show how D65 is doing in comparison to neighboring districts and also to comparable districts. So you can see on page 13 that about 49% of our students are meeting standards in English Language Arts. And that puts us in the bottom quartile of neighboring districts, largely because we have a very different population than many of these other school districts in terms of the percent of students who are receiving a free reduced price lunch. So to give you a different comparison, if you look at page 14, you can see our district, again, outperforming the state average and being right in the middle of the pack of peer districts. And here the peer districts are selected based on having a similar per pupil expenditure and also having a similar percent of students who receive a free or reduced price lunch. Next, if we turn to math, you can see a very similar picture to what I showed you for English Language Arts. Here, in fact, you can see that we are outperforming the district average pretty significantly. I'm sorry, outperforming the state average. So we have 8% of students in Category 5 compared to 3% statewide, and almost 40% in Category 4 compared to about a quarter statewide. So our performance in math compared to the state is a little bit stronger than our performance in English Language Arts. And then this chart has the same layout as the one we looked at for English Language Arts, where what you can see is that about half of our students, 47%, are proficient on the PARCC math test, which is actually a little bit higher than we would have predicted with our MAP test, but far below where we were performing with the ISAT data that we were looking at in the past from the state. So you can just get a sense from both this chart and the reading chart that part of what many parents are seeing in terms of a difference of their students' score between ISAT and PARCC really has to do with the fact that the PARCC cut point is significantly different than what we had for ISAT. And then let me just conclude the district results by showing you the math results for neighboring districts where, much like reading, we perform below average compared to neighboring districts. but right in the middle of the pack, in fact, a little above average in comparison to the comparable districts. So I kind of whizzed through that, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have in just a moment when we wrap up. But I want to conclude by just giving you 3 updates about testing for next year. One of the things that we did last year after we hosted some similar community meetings is to write an open letter to the state superintendent with some of the concerns that we had and concerns that we heard from our community about PARCC testing. We knew that many parents wanted to opt out of testing. In fact, last year we had about 10% of parents, 10% of students across the district who refused to take the test. We do not have an ability under our state law to opt out. That was considered last year by the legislature and turned down. But our students do have an ability to refuse the test, and in fact about 10% of them did. And so I feel like this is reflecting a lot of what we see in the media and what we hear when we talk to folks in the community about concerns about standardized testing and about the state test. So the letter that we shared with the state superintendent reflected our belief that a good summative test that gives both the district, the school, and the student and family a sense of where things stand at the end of the year and how the student is doing in comparison to state averages is a good and important thing to do. But it shouldn't take 2 test windows and the amount of time that it was taking. And further, we were frustrated because we already have a local test that we feel gives us that good information, and that we did not want to have to give up our local test in order to have a state test where we weren't going to get the results until the following fall. So I think we're making some progress, and you can see a couple of the changes that were made as a result of the concerns that we expressed and that many other people across Illinois and other states expressed. One thing is that we're going to only have 1 testing window this year, whereas last year we had 2 different testing windows. This is, I think, going to be a lot easier for us and our testing coordinators and our students. Part of the reason that we can move it to just 1 testing window is that we're going to have a reduced number of testing units. So last year we had 8 or 9 different testing units. This year we will only have 6 or 7 testing units. And the net impact of that is that depending on the grade and the subject we're talking about, we're going to reduce test time by 30 minutes in English Language Arts and 60 minutes in math, such that students will test somewhere between about 6.5 and 9 total hours of testing. So it's a lot of testing. The one thing I do want to point out is that while there is a wide window of almost a month where there will be testing, we're not shutting school down for a month. Students will usually be exposed to 1 or 2 tests a day over a course of about a week, for a total of, depending on their grade level, about 6 to 9 hours of testing. I think it's a little much, but that's what's being required of us by the state at this point. So that's all I've got to share, and I'd be really glad to answer questions about anything we've talked about or anything else that's on your mind. Mm-hmm.
And as a start, they're not the only ones who go to these schools.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing is 2 all
Mm-hmm.
what were the numbers meaning when there was a tendency of some students as too much time
Mm-hmm.
to pull it off?
Yeah. So I think your students are probably not alone. I think most administrators and teachers were encouraging students not to stress too much about the test, but also to do their best. And that's clearly not been the case in every classroom or for every student. What I would point out, just in terms of interpreting the summative results, let's take a look at English again for a second. Even though that's probably true of some students and in some classrooms, when you look at the green bar, which represents PARCC proficiency, and the kind of light blue turquoisey bar that represents proficiency on MAP, we're seeing almost the same result. And if we were to cut the ISAT data on the left at a similar cut point to what's being used, we probably would see something pretty similar there too. So part of what gives me a little faith in these data is that when we look at it in aggregate, we're getting a very similar result to what we see based on other information that we've collected before. But clearly, I think the concern that you raise is definitely valid, and I think particularly when you get into middle school and high school, it's a concern that has to be sorted out as we go forward. Yeah. So actually that question I can answer, which is that the high school uses our MAP test results for placement. We also do some acceleration in math, and for that we also use our MAP test. So until the PARCC test is something that we really understand, that we've seen the growth and we've had consistent results for a number of years, we and the high school will continue to use the MAP for placement. Yeah. Well, that's good feedback for us to get so that we can help get teachers to be more encouraging and express the answers. Yeah, what question?
I have a question. My son obviously attends one of the district's 65 schools. The scores that the principal made some gesture saying that they were kind of disappointed in the scores from last year for the third grade class. My son wasn't in the third grade last year, so the second grade was. But part of the problem was that the students complained that the screens were freezing up while they were taking the exam. How is that taken into consideration, A, for the students, and B, for the district overall, in comparison to state scores?
Yeah. Well, let me repeat your question just because there may be some folks who weren't able to hear who were watching online. So the first part of the question was just about a school where the third graders were having some technology problems, and how does that get translated into the scoring of the test. And so I think there's a couple answers. One is that going into this, we were pretty concerned about our ability to carry this off from a technology point of view. Just having worked in other districts implementing electronic assessments, I knew that there could be some real problems. And so we definitely encountered the situation that you're describing where in some classrooms some students were having problems. But we collected help desk tickets in my office from teachers who were struggling, and we actually across the district I think only logged 90 help desk calls around this topic over the course of testing. So that's part of it. The other thing that happened was that if a student continued to struggle on a subtest such that they really didn't have a decent testing experience and weren't able to show their abilities, the teacher was instructed to let their assessment coordinator in the school know, and then the assessment coordinator would let me know, and we would submit a form to the state that said we should invalidate a particular test. So I think there probably are some students whose scores ended up getting represented maybe because they got booted out of the test once, but then they were able to log back in and complete the session, largely because the session windows were a lot longer than most students needed to complete the tasks. And in extreme cases, they would have let my office know, and then we would tell the state to invalidate the test. That's right. Yes.
I'm not sure if that wasn't done.
Yeah.
And now that necessarily skewed.
Yeah. So in the case of a particular student, I think you're absolutely right, especially because this was the first year of testing and everybody was getting used to it. My hope is, and just like the conversation over here, it gives me good feedback of what we can talk to our assessment coordinators about and make sure we're having good communication about what needs to happen. I think in most cases it was taken care of, but obviously I can't guarantee it, and your student was in the room, so I think they probably can provide you the best feedback about that. Yeah, question back here?
So, again, this, once again, you were saying it's not really good that
Mm-hmm.
but then I thought you said it might be replacement.
No, I was confirming that we will not be using the test for placement. We use our MAP assessment for placement.
I heard you say about being able to use for a longer time.
Yeah, so my hope is that we can have so the question, in case you didn't hear, was about, could we use PARCC as a placement test in the future? And the answer to that is, I don't know. If the state continues to develop PARCC such that it is valid and reliable, and we have good experiences with it, and it's giving us consistent results for our students, I would rather not give both the MAP and the PARCC test, and I assume that we will be required to continue giving the PARCC. So I could imagine a scenario several years down the road where we could consider that kind of a decision, but we're definitely not anywhere near that at this point. Yes, a number of states have dropped out of PARCC. There's about 6 states that are continuing in it, and Illinois is one of them. Yes. So until Illinois makes another choice, we need to continue to give the test, but we will also be continuing to give the MAP test so that we have trend data for our students and the ability to have a test replacement. Yeah. What other questions? Yeah.
I understand how teachers or students are going to work with the data to address issues that students may have in their schools.
Yeah. So again, what we've done for this year is to give the PARCC data back to the teachers. We had several workshops where we invited principals and teachers to come and learn about the data. For this year, I think folks are really in a learning mode about what the assessment scores mean. We do a lot of work with our MAP data, with our DRA data, which is for kindergarten through 2nd grade, with our ISIL data, where we look at the test results not 9 months later, but right after the assessment is completed, and we have what we call a response to intervention process, where for students who are on the struggling end of the spectrum, we create plans to help give them support so that they can come back to meeting grade level standards. For students on other parts of the spectrum, classroom teachers often use those data to create flexible groups so that they can do small group instruction and have one group that's being asked to perform tasks at a higher level. For the PARCC data, we're really using this as an opportunity for them to learn. A lot of teachers have been comparing the MAP results and the PARCC results and trying to puzzle out what the differences are. And quite frankly, my team and I are in a learning mode about that as well, having just gotten the results about a month ago and seeing how does PARCC and MAP compare with one another. So for now, the short answer is we're using all of our other testing to make regular modifications to what's happening in the classroom, and we're investigating the PARCC data to see what utility it might have for that kind of activity going forward. Oh. Yeah. So we do post it on our on the parent portal, but oftentimes it takes my team longer to get that done because there's a number of other things underway. But what we do is ask all of our schools to send a hard copy report home. So if that's not happening, let's chat afterward or chat with your school principal, and I'll make sure that our communication is clear going forward to get those out. Yeah. Yeah.
It seems to me like if you look down the road and think possibly that our test might be used more like the MAP test, so maybe you're only administering one assessment, you're going to need to get the results a whole lot faster than we're getting them now with PARCC, because with MAP, the students get the results right away when they take the test.
Yes.
And instant feedback from the teachers. So do you have any sense of whether, I know this was the first year with administrators, but maybe there's a longer time before results are reported. Do you have a sense that that time frame could be shortened up as we go down the road, or is it always going to be like a 9 months?
So I would be really surprised if it continued to be a 9-month window. And well, I can tell you why. Yeah. Yeah. It was September, yeah. So I can tell you why it was 9 months this time and why I think it'll be shorter next time, but I also don't want to speak on behalf of what the state will or won't do because I'm kind of not sure. The reason that it took 9 months is that about half the state took the test on paper and pencil and the other half did it online. And so they had to scan all of the paper tests in, And then they created the data file and went through the level setting process that I described earlier. So this year, in addition to actually scoring the test, they had to come up with how to score the test. And so that was the reason for the extra delay. I'm sort of anticipating this year, given that they're making the changes that I described before, there may be a level setting process that has to happen again, given the changes to the test, because when you take those many units out of the test, you're kind of scoring a new test. So I'm not sure what to expect for this year. But once a stable way of setting the test scores happens, I would think that if you have an electronic administration and a scoring algorithm on the back end, there isn't any reason why we shouldn't be able to have at least a preliminary test score as soon as the student takes the test. And I know that's the vision that the state has for the test. I just don't know how long it's going to take to get there. Yeah.
So, in math and art, is there something in math, not in math and art, finance and art that's not math, that the state doesn't, like, why, it doesn't understand why there's two separate tests, and I think it's really one gives you feedback further here, one gives you the beginning of that. I don't understand why you have math, right? Or is there something different between the two that is measured differently? Or is it?
Well, so both tests are built on the Common Core standards. So they both head off to say, I want to measure a student's ability to read this text and understand what's in the text and be able to answer questions about the text, as an example. What's different between the two is that the PARCC test has a richer set of question types. So with the MAP test, mostly we're asking, actually exclusively we're asking multiple choice questions. So in the story, did the characters do X, Y? Did you read about the characters doing choice 1, choice 2, choice 3, and pick one? In the PARCC test, there are open-ended responses that students actually wrote an essay and that was scored by hand. There are places like in the math test where they have to drag 3 numbers onto a number line and show which one is bigger and which one is smaller. So it does engage the student in a deeper type of task than the MAP test can. So PARCC does have the ability to perhaps give us some richer information than the MAP test can. But the other difference is the MAP test was developed many years ago. It's been in use for a long time. It's got good growth norms that are behind it. So it's developed, it's off the shelf, and we can buy it, as opposed to PARCC, which the state is trying to develop in collaboration with other states. Yeah.
A scaling question. Do all of our schools now know when our schools are?
So each school knows the window, and we're working with the assessment coordinator at each school to actually set up the test windows for the individual classes. So at some point, probably about a month before the testing window opens, each school will have finalized its schedule. But at this point, different schools are at different places and actually setting up their schedules of which classes are going to test on which units on which days. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's nice to know when this kind of thing's happening, so maybe the schools are not planning,
Mm-hmm.
test might be, or they should know right now, but how, you're saying, like, we're planning on our calendar, where they would manage.
Sorry, I think I am answering a different question than you're asking. I thought you were asking, do we know when individual students in classrooms are going to test within the window? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Yep. So what we do is create an assessment calendar for the district with all the assessments that are common across classrooms in the district, and we post that to principals and faculty at the beginning of the school year, and we also post it on our district website. So if you were to go under district65.net, and click on the curriculum area, you'll see a link for assessment, and by grade level, all of the different assessment windows are there. This last year, we released it just at the beginning of school. This year, we're working to get it ready before the beginning of summer. And so the only difference between schools is that generally, we don't set windows that are bigger than schools need to conduct a particular assessment. But there are tests, and then there are makeup tests. And exactly which days are tests and which ones are makeup tests would be up to the principal and the assessment coordinator. So I would check in with them. I would guess many schools already know approximately what they're planning to do. Yeah.
I have a first and third grader, and do you think that the third graders would practice some of the tests?
Mm-hmm.
Is anything one of those results or at all? I mean, I know not in terms of report to the state, but do the teachers, when they go to that next week, the student teacher conference,
Mm-hmm.
they just happen in December for us?
Mm-hmm.
But does anything happen with those, or do you use the district look at those to be see how things are going, or the department taking?
Yeah, so we don't put a lot of emphasis on trying to predict what our PARCC scores are. We more put emphasis on our students progressing with the kind of tasks that will be part of the PARCC test, because the PARCC is testing the standards that we're trying to teach. So for example, some students will engage in an on-demand writing activity where they're asked to write an essay without additional editing. So we're looking at how well can they write a particular piece of writing just by being given a prompt and a certain amount of time to write about it. And those types of assessments, the teachers score and then provide feedback to the students. So depending on what grade level you're in, I would guess that your classroom teacher might share that with you at the conferences. And I know many teachers also create other kinds of classroom assessments that look a lot like PARCC, largely because PARCC is oriented toward our standards and they use a wide range of really useful item types. So it's generally not teaching to the test, not preparing for the test, but doing items that look a lot like the test because that's what's part of our curriculum.
Where's the best place to go to just get on the student levels? Is it under shares of the investigation, all of the work,
So for how you scored in your particular school, I would recommend the state report card, which is illinoisreportcard.com. We also, if you just go to district65.net and type in PARCC, we maintain a PARCC information page. And we also have an assessment calendar that will explain the different types of assessments that we have and how they all fit together, so you could click on your student's grade level and kind of see the different types of assessment your child's teacher would be giving. Yeah. No, there aren't changes to the procedures for opting students out this time around. The federal law, it requires that states require that districts offer the test to every student. And so in District 65, we have to walk this fine line between following the state policy so that we don't jeopardize any funding, while also being really respectful, which we want to be, about parents' feelings about whether the PARCC is an appropriate test for their students. So if your student were to go to a testing session and say, I don't want to take this test, the teacher won't make them, sit there and do nothing. They won't, in any way make the situation uncomfortable. That's the instruction that we've given to all principals, but we do have to actually offer the test to each student. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, it's not currently possible. So I have the sort of underlying data file that we got from the state, and all that I have access to is just those 3 categories. Yeah. I don't know what the cost per student is for PARCC. I think, yeah, I don't know what that cost is. The state has a contract with the vendor, but I don't know what the cost is or how that breaks down per student. I know it's significantly higher for the districts that are doing it on paper. In terms of the MAP assessment, I pay the contract and I know what the aggregate total is, but I can't remember exactly how that breaks down on a per student basis. I think it's somewhere between $10 and $20 for a student, but you can give it to them both at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, and we also choose in the winter to give the test to students who might have been struggling at the teacher and the principal's discretion. So, for example, some schools that were focused on literacy gave the test in the winter to students who were below the 25th percentile at the beginning of the year, and some teachers who found it useful went ahead and gave the test to all the students in their class. Other questions? Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I'll count on Melissa to pull me off the stage because this is my favorite topic and I'll talk about it all night long. Let me just give you like the 3 bullet point answer, which is we tend to use our MAP assessment to track our progress over time because it gives us a consistent trend. If you go on our website under Research Accountability and Data and then Reports, we just published our 2015 Achievement and Accountability Report, which will show you what we're seeing in terms of trends, look at it by grade, look at it by student subgroup, and also our measure of student growth, which is on MAP, and that's the percentage of students who are making nationally normed gains. What we see, because we've just created a new measure of kindergarten readiness, is that when kids come to District 65, about half of them enter at our benchmark. And if we break that by income, about a quarter of our students coming from a low-income background meet that benchmark, and about 75% of the students from a higher income background hit the benchmark. And what we're seeing when we look at that trend by grade across District 65 and then into District 202 is that that trend stays pretty constant the whole way through. And what I interpret that to mean is students are making a year of progress consistently every year, but it's not enough progress to move the student who came in, let's say at the 25th percentile up to the college and career ready benchmark. So that's the issue that we've really identified in our data and that we're actively working on. In terms of trends, just in terms of the percent who are college ready and in terms of growth, we've seen a downward trend over the last 3 or 4 years, which then in the last year sort of flattened out, which we take as a hopeful sign that we really want to build on. And what we're seeing in terms of our student growth is that that number was also going down for a period of about 4 years. And in the most recent year, it rebounded and about 4% more students made expected gains in 2015 than they had in 2014. So in our data, we see a couple of signs of possible early signs of hope from last year's data. But unfortunately, before that, we were seeing a downward trend. And what we see when we look at the data kind of in the most macro way is that kids come in and get 1 full year of growth on average for every year that they're here. But it's not yet enough to help us move students who come in a little bit behind to catch up. Yeah.
So
Mhm.
or, hey, this is a global problem, or this is a very general problem. So I'm sort of struggling with understanding, on some level, the utility of this.
Mhm.
I would go for students, for the district, for the teachers, what can we really do with this?
So I kind of have two answers for you. I think one is I would just really affirm part of what you're saying. With PARCC as it exists today, with us getting data this late, it's really not very useful for us in a lot of ways. We definitely aren't planning to use it in teacher evaluation unless there are changes to the test. We won't use it for any consequence, any kind of placement for a student, and the data really come too late for us to use it for any type of instructional improvement. That having been said, I think the possibility continues to exist that the designers of the test could improve it to give us more useful reports. It's really exciting to have a state test after we've had ISAT for so many years that has these complex item types where students could really demonstrate what they know how to do in writing an essay and placing numbers on a number line, a whole range of items that weren't available through the multiple choice option. And so in our district, what we have done is to participate fully, both from a compliance perspective, but also from a trying to help the state move along the path of having a great state assessment. Because if we can have a great state assessment that gives us all the things we need, which I think PARCC is capable of doing and does so with better item types than the map has, we and every other district across the state can save money in our assessment budgets and reduce the amount of time that our students are spending on assessment. So there's some hope that this could be a really great tool for us, and we're kind of bumbling and chunking along right now with a test that isn't currently meeting the full promise that it could have. Right. So the teachers have a roster for their current students with exactly what you've seen on the score report tonight. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it sixth grade in literature arts? Is my whole class taking it during that hour, or is it individualized when we go take the test?
So it's generally that your whole class will go and do it together, just because that's the easiest way in terms of scheduling. However, we do have some students who in their individualized education plans have accommodations for testing. So for example, if I were to be given the test in a different format, or a common accommodation is to give me more time, then I probably would be given a different time of day and a different venue in which to take the test, so that everyone else in the class isn't moving on while I'm still trying to work through my test. So we try to give people, students, a good environment in which to take it. Yeah. No, generally not. What we emphasize in terms of preparing for the test is to teach the curriculum that we've designed really well, and to use the assessments that we have as a district, many of which demonstrate item types that are part of the PARCC test. Our students at all grade levels get lots of hands-on opportunities to use technology. And so last year we did do a little, some teachers did a little practice just because, for example, on the math test there's an equation editor where students have to be able to go in and type fractions and a few things that wouldn't necessarily be an easy thing to do based on the other kinds of technology activities that a student may have done. So there's maybe a lesson here or there where a teacher would make sure students know how to use the tools that are part of the assessment, but we don't have time where we're specifically teaching how to take the test. Mm-hmm. Mhm. Yeah.
Now write an essay, which is like, okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
read it, it's much different from that.
Yeah.
And I've read it, it's really good.
Yeah. It is quite different from MAP, and
I love that it's deep.
yeah.
Personal story and analysis and theme and writing about it. But
Yeah.
this one thing, I mean,
Yeah.
we have problems.
Yeah. And so I think part of it is as our teachers become more comfortable and know what might be challenging for students, it really helps them, you know, offer some opportunity to learn how to do the things that they're going to need to know how to do technologically in order to succeed with the test. But we're not totally there yet, which is part of the reason that there aren't consequences to the test, right? That's why part of the reason we don't use it for placement is I don't want a student to struggle with the interface and therefore not get to take a certain class. Any last questions that we should address as a group? It is, to be specific, April 18th through May 27th is the full window. Yes?
A question about that. So the test, is it testing kind of year-end expectations like what you're supposed to have? So in theory, if somebody's taking it on the 18th, is going to be disadvantaged compared to someone who's taking it on the 27th? Is it progress less curriculum?
Yeah. Potentially, yes. However, the state has standards about when in the school year it can be given in order for it to be instructionally relevant in terms of the student having had most of the content. And our district's window comes right at the end of what the state allows. So most of our students have an advantage over many other school districts in terms of when. And generally what we see when we look at the norms on the MAP test, for example, is that a few weeks of instruction doesn't make a big difference in terms of how the student performs on the MAP test. So I think the same is likely true on PARCC, but you know, if you've got another month of instruction, maybe you have learned something that you could demonstrate. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there are kind of a number of places. At the federal level, there has recently been a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That probably is most familiar to folks as No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. The reauthorization is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. It was just passed back in December, and it continues to require that standardized tests administered at the state level be part of the accountability framework. It does, however, create a number of flexibilities that weren't there in the past. So I don't expect there to be much change at the federal level going forward, although I think your legislators at the national level are a good place to be communicating. I think more of what will change would be at the state level. There was a law signed on July 30th of this last year called the Balanced Accountability Act. And that act you can read about in our Achievement and Accountability Report, some of the background on it. But it put into effect a system where 30% of the district's accountability rating would be based on standardized test scores, the other 70% based on other purposes. I think that law is now outdated in comparison to the new requirements of ESSA. So I think there's an opportunity to influence state policymakers on what would be best going forward. And I think the other opportunity is to be in communication with the state superintendent at the State Board of Education. These are definitely folks that we as an administration keep in contact with, just to really in a spirit of continuous improvement and like wanting us to have the best system possible. I'm regularly in communication with my assessment counterpart at the state with feedback, and I know the superintendent is in communication with different legislators and policymakers. So I think as parents, you can certainly consider those avenues of expressing the things that you wish could be better or different about the system that we have.
Because on the website, I know there are ways to get it, but do you guys probably use it for actually as well?
I believe it is, or if not, then I'll put it there soon, on the PARCC page that we have as a district.
Because it's pretty different from how we tested as kids.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, you definitely have to take multiple choice out of your head with this new test. All right, well, thank you all very much. I'm glad to stay around and answer any additional questions that you may have.